Wouldn't it be great to find some peace of mind, right? Something that not just isn't just a moment, but it's like something that sticks with us and lasts with us and goes with us no matter where we're at. So that's my hope, that over these few weeks we're talking about this, that's where we all can kind of get to, that we can discover something that Jesus offered to us, but we don't always take hold of. And I'm going to kind of do a quick review of where we're at last week as we've talked, because in my mind, the thing that pushes back the peace of mind for the vast majority of us is this thing called fear, right? And it's fear of lots of different things and lots of different ways fear attacks us. But I want to remind you of what we talked about last week. First of all, simply this, that fear isn't always a bad thing, right? You have a big 150-pound dog running at you, snarling, stuff slipping off of its mouth and growling and barking at you. You ought to be afraid, right? And if you're driving along and you lose traction, you go over a cliff, you ought to be afraid at that moment, right? So fear isn't always a bad thing. In fact, as I told you last week, and this is the thing I think we forget about fear. Fear is really just a part of our internal alarm system. It's something that God has put in us. And you may not be a person that sort of believes in God, or you're not kind of sure you're right there, or not sure about this whole creation stuff. You know that even for you, that fear is a part of your system, right? Because there's something that happens that you can't control in those moments. It just strikes up, right? And it's warning us. It's just reminding us. And we all learned about this in high school biology, right? It's the flight or fight. Or now we add a new one, freeze, right? Which I told you last week, I'm thrilled they added that, because that's typically the response we get sometimes, right? Some of us are like, fight back, try. Some are like, run. And some are just like, what am I going to do? And we just get frozen in the moment. But it's our alarm. It's our body saying, pay attention. Danger, danger, danger. And we're like, I don't know what to do with that, but I'm hearing the alarm, right? So fear isn't always a bad thing, but the reality is sometimes it is. And some of us have had fear impact us in such dramatic ways, such ways that literally have impacted our life in a very negative way. And that's when fear gets out of balance, when fear, the alarm gets so loud that we don't go looking for the reason there's an alarm, we just get stuck with that alarm. But knowing that, there's also another side to fear, and that's sometimes it's a good thing, right? Again, there's times we ought to be fearful, that we ought to have a little sense of anxiety that pops up like, can I do this, or should I do this, or what's going on? Because not only sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a normal thing, sometimes it's the right thing. In fact, today we're going to look at part of a day in the life of Jesus that centers around somebody who had fear, and it was not necessarily a good thing for this person, but it was a normal thing. It was the right thing in the moment with all that was going on. And the great thing we're going to discover is as it begins at this very anxiety, fear-filled moment, it has an unexpected twist that changes how this person saw fear, and I think maybe even how we can see it. But before we get to that story, I want to invite you to bow your heads, and let's pray one more time together, right? Father, I think of those words that we've just sung, right? That you are more than able. And for those of us that have faith in you, we know that's true. But like the song says, there are those moments that we have let ourselves forget that. We have piled up stories and reasons to not see that. But I pray again that you would, as my sister Lydia prayed earlier, that you give us eyes to see. Not just brains to understand, but eyes to see. Something that we'll see that will remind us that you're more than able. And so today, I just pray that you can use this story that you, for some reason, intentionally wanted included in the stories that we tell today, and use it to tell us a story that hopefully can make us think, that can make us respond, that can make us choose maybe a different path than the one we're on right now. And if you can help us push back to fear and push forward, whether it's in faith or in fear that's tempered by by your presence, this will have been time well spent. And we can leave here today in a much better space. In your name, amen. If you want to follow along, we're going to be over in part of the Bible called John. It's written by one of the closest followers of Jesus. It's stories of Jesus' life. He has a little bit different versions of other ones. He has a reason for telling those. We're over in chapter 8. And a little backstory. Jesus has, just before this, his brothers have gotten on him because Jesus' brothers don't believe that he's anything special. Maybe mama thinks you're special, but you're not that special, right? And so Jesus is starting to get a following. He's doing miracles, and they're all like, hey, Jesus, the big feast for us as Jews is coming up. One of the big 7 feasts. It was called the Feast of Tabernacles or Shelters. It was right after Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It was this reminder of how God had been with them, had been there with their people through the wilderness coming out of Egypt, right? So it's this big celebration. People go live in tents for a week, and it's one of the big 7. And so everybody's going up to Jerusalem for this, and the brothers are like, hey, this would be a perfect time for you, brother, to go show off your stuff, right? I mean, it's be great. Go up, somebody's going to do miracles. This is the spot to do it. So everybody can know. And Jesus is like, no, I'm not going up. My time isn't here. I'm not going up. You guys go up, but I'm not going up. And they go, and then just like a couple days later, Jesus goes, which is out of inner story. You ought to go read it. There's a whole reason why, and he kind of explains it, right? But he gets up there. He kind of sneaks around. Here's kind of the stories. Here's what's going on. Kind of senses that people are starting to talk about him. And then on the final day of the festival, he decides to go to the temple, which is this epicenter of Jewish faith. It's the place where God resides, where we meet with God, where we respond to God, the sacrifice are made, everything centers around, and it's a massive thing. I read something that's like, the temple itself is like something like 35 acres. I mean, it's just this massive building. And it's impressive. You got these huge stairs you go up, and 10 gates that you enter in through. It's this kind of building that you would go to and go, wow, that's impressive, right? And maybe even a little bit of, I'm not sure I ought to go in there because that looks like something really impressive, and maybe I shouldn't kind of go there. But it's that kind of thing. It just gives you awe as you enter it. And so Jesus has done that. The feast is ended, and now we pick up the story on the next day after that. Okay, we're all together? Yes. There we go. So John tells us, hey, early in the morning, that is the next morning, early in the morning, he went back to the temple. He goes back to the temple courts. And again, I'll remind you that this is the place of God's activity and presence, God's place on earth, right? This is an important spot for all of them. And John tells us all the people came to him, which is kind of crazy because this is like early morning. This is like right at dawn, right? And it's like, how did they know? I mean, did they hear the radio announcements? They see the flyer stuck up? Apparently people just, once they started to hear Jesus, somebody was always watching, and they were waiting, and the news got around real fast, and a whole bunch of people show up in the temple. And so Jesus finds a spot in this massive building. He sits down, and he begins to teach it. And that's the setting. And this happens over and over in Jesus' ministry, where he sits and he teaches, and especially in the temple, because he's making a statement, right? This is the place of God, and lo and behold, Jesus is now here teaching. And they've been amazed by his teaching because they're like, this guy didn't have any formal training. He didn't go all the rabbinical schools that other rabbis do. Something's going on here. But then if this was a movie, we'd have this great scene and this teaching, and everybody like, ah. And then the music would change, right? It always happens in the movie, right? Because here's what happened next. John tells us that the teachers of the law, the scribes, these were the religious lawyers. They were the ones who said, here's what the law says, and this is what it means, and this is how you apply it. And the Pharisees, and they weren't like paid to be good. They were just good kind of, they were devout followers of God. In fact, they were so devout that they wanted to make sure everybody followed God, whether they wanted to or not, because everybody had to do that. The really devout people, they bring a woman who had been, and here's a little spoiler alert, maybe this is a little too graphic, but it's there, so we're going to do it. But she was caught in adultery. That's right. Thanks, Carlton. But no. I mean, so this is kind of one of those moments where everybody goes, uh-oh, because she's caught, right? And so, there's lots of ways we can go with that. But this is early in the morning. You're thinking, wait, this is early in the morning. I mean, this is like, not when she's doing the walk of shame, right? This is like before that, because she's caught in the act, not after the act, where she's kind of like, hey, it's real early. And we don't know if they got her really early, last night, and kind of have just held her for this time. Maybe it was kind of a after all the bars closed kind of thing. I don't know, but they've caught this woman, and she's caught in the act. We're going to find out, which tells me that she probably didn't have time to fix her hair. I'm kind of seeing her just with a sheet because they probably let her have a sheet because these are devout religious people. I mean, some of the Pharisees were so committed to following God and his rules that they wouldn't look at a woman. They were called the black and blue Pharisees. All of this. You got to go look this up. They're black and blue Pharisees, and they're called black and blue Pharisees because they wouldn't look at a woman. They put their head down, close their eyes, and they'd run into things. True story. Because that showed how devout they were. You know, they got these bruises, because they're just, I don't look on a woman with lust, and so I'm good. So they would have let her cover up somehow. But I picture her getting drug in with just a sheet around her, and the whole crowd goes, uh-oh, right? In fact, it gets worse, because not only do they bring her in, and they've come up these massive stairs till they find Jesus, because apparently they know where he's at, and they make her, they force her to stand before the people. And I want you to get that picture, right? And I want you to get in your mind how she has to feel at this moment, right? And just standing there, not just in front of these devoutly religious people, but now Jesus, and I'm sure she's heard something about Jesus, and there's this crowd of people, right? We don't know how many a crowd is, but we have to imagine it's a pretty good-sized crowd because thousands of people come to Jerusalem for this feast. It ended the day before, but Jesus is around. They might hang around for a little bit longer. In this group, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the religious lawyers, they say to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught having sexual relations with a man who was not her husband." She was caught literally in the very act of adultery. Which again, when you start breaking the story apart, it seems like these guys are a little creepy, right? I mean, they're just kind of looking to see anybody flirting and anybody who flirting shouldn't be flirting. Let's follow them and let's count just a little bit longer. Okay, now we break. I mean, it's just like, whoa, this is kind of creepy, right? But they've caught her and they're saying, listen, there's no doubt about this. She's caught red-handed, right? She's got, there's no question about this. It wasn't like we saw her the next morning taking that walk and we're like, we kind of know where you've been, but we don't have actual proof. We got proof on this woman, Jesus. And oh, by the way, Jesus, the law of Moses commands that we stone to death every woman who does this. So, Jesus, what do you say we should do? What do you say we should do, Jesus? And again, as you read the story, you recognize that there's a whole lot of holes in this thing, right? Because they aren't just devout people trying to keep everybody walking the straight and narrow. These are people who have grabbed this woman and whether they intentionally got her or whether they got her and thought, this is a great opportunity to get somebody else. But now they put her in front of Jesus. And they simply want to know, what are you going to do? What are you going to do, Jesus? And you can imagine the shame, the embarrassment, the fear, the anxiety this woman is feeling at this moment, right? I mean, you can imagine the people in the crowd. I mean, some of them are embarrassed and feel shame for her and embarrassed themselves that they're witnessing this and they're wondering about these devoutly religious people capturing somebody in the act and then bringing her like that here and doing all this stuff. And the fear that goes out and the anxiety that goes out. I mean, the reality is, this is the last place that she wants to be. And if she wasn't aware of her sin last night, she is overwhelmed with the reality this morning. And John gives us a little extra commentary that we already know. He says, they, the religious leaders, were asking this to test Jesus so they could have some accusation against him. That this wasn't about the woman, this wasn't about the law, this was about, we're going to get you, Jesus. And this is a great opportunity because we got somebody in the act of it. And now we got her in front of you, and we know what the law says, right? We know what Moses says. Now you're in a tough spot, Jesus. Because they reminded me, it's the law. It's the law like one of the big 10 of the law, right? In fact, it's one of the big 10 the few that people remember, right? Yeah, somebody, what's the 10 Commandments? Like, let's see, don't steal, don't kill, don't have adultery, and something about lying. I'm not sure, right? But it makes even the cut on most people's cuts, right? But it's like one of the big 10s. This is a thing, Jesus. And besides that, it's Moses, who was like, the guy for them, right? Moses, whatever Moses said, we're following what Moses said. And Moses will add to the 10, because Moses has his own set of commands, these laws that he passes down from God. And one of them does say, in fact, twice it says that when you catch somebody in adultery, you catch, people messing with people they shouldn't be messing with, you stone them both. You kill them. And so now they have all that information, all that law, we have everything. We don't need anymore. We have final. She's here. What do you say? What do you say to all this, Jesus? Now, when I read this story, I love how Jesus handles situations, because he does it so much better than anybody I've ever known. Because there's lots of ways I would have gone. I mean, I might have gone this way, and Jesus could have, but he doesn't. But I might have gone, hey, let's just play this game of laws, guys, right? Let's go back to the law you talk about, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. And it says, if a man has sexual relations, commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the man and the woman are guilty of adultery and must be put to death. So here's the question. Right? I mean, have you ever read this story and thought, this seems weird? They got the woman, but where's the guy? Because you can't do this by yourself, right? Well, what did the story? And people have come up with lots of theories. Nobody knows, but it just is like, it seems weird. They got her, but the guy got a pass, which makes it even sound a little bit more like maybe they were a little bit of entrapment here because they were trying to catch something bigger. Back to there, it says, that they were asking this to trap Jesus, right? They wanted to bring some kind of charge against him. And why that's so important, if you don't really know much about Jesus, this is so important because Jesus had become a big deal. And we all know how it works. But whatever your career path is, whatever you maybe it's a sports team, whatever you got that's kind of meaningful to you, you know that when somebody else gets successful, one side we kind of like it, and the other side we're like, they're getting a little bit too successful, right? We start to sort of figure out ways to break them down because Jesus was threatening to shake up everything. And you know how it is when we like how things are? We don't like it when people threaten to shake things up. So we set up tests, right? We stack the deck. We kind of set the stage. We hope that we can kind of find some kind of charge so that we can make them look bad because their goal was to divide Jesus from the people. And this is like the perfect opportunity, right? I mean, think about it. They have a crowd. They got the place. And they got the perfect situation. They are in the temple, the place of God on earth. They have a clear breaking of not just one of the 10 commandments, but that command and even a Moses command and what we ought to be doing with this. And they have a crowd now to watch, to help put the pressure on Jesus, because what can Jesus do in this situation? And it's clear as you read the story that this isn't about the woman. She's simply a means to an end. And then I love the next word that John writes about what happened. One of my favorite words in the Bible. In fact, one of my favorite words in the English language. And I'm guessing for a lot of us, it's our favorite word too. And here it is. But, right? Because but always means, hold on, right? Therefore is how I would say it. I was doing proper English, right? Therefore, but, hold on. Before we get too far, this story isn't done. Because they think they're in a really good spot now, right? They got him just where they want him, where Jesus, is he going to fight? Is he going to flight? Is he going to run? Or is he just going to freeze and let's see what happens? But John says, Jesus bent over. He stooped down, and he starts writing on the ground with his finger, which seems like a weird thing to do, right? In fact, here, kids, I'll give you something to try, an experiment, all right? Next time your teacher asks you a really hard question or your parents ask you a really hard question, just get a piece of paper and start doodling around there and see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. I just think it'd be interesting to hear some of the stories, but that's a little extra for today. But I mean, he sits down and he starts writing with his finger, right? And it's like, what's going on here? And the crazy thing is, I'll give you a little, spoiler alert, we never find out what Jesus wrote. People have speculated, he said this, or he was talking about people's, individual sins, or he's doing, the stuff. We don't know what he said, and all that is purely speculation. But what we do know is that the law that they were talking about was the only thing that we have that was written by God. You know that, right? The Bible wasn't written by God. It was inspired by God, but it wasn't written by God. The only thing we're told that actually God himself wrote, 10 Commandments, right? I can't do it with this thing in my hand. But you get the point, right? 10 Commandments. Yes. So they're saying the thing that God wrote with his hand, we got to do it. And now Jesus, Son of God, fully human, writes on the ground. I love it. Just kind of an interesting coincidence. I don't know what it means, but it seems like kind of a moment, right? Because again, they're in the temple, the place where you meet God, where you hear teaching, where the sacrifices take place, where they talk about this law, and now Jesus is writing with his finger. And apparently he writes for quite a while. Because John says, when they continue to ask Jesus their question, so they keep after him. What are you going to do, Jesus? The law. We have the law. Do we have to tell the story again? You know how it is when you get in one of those situations where people keep going over the same thing over and over and over again? And it's so helpful, isn't it? Because it's like, I didn't get it the first 10 times. It's just keep going, right? Yeah. Law, woman caught in the act, got the law. We're told what to do. What are we going to do, right? Did you miss any part of that? Let's just go. It's like, and here's the crazy thing. I think that the longer he waited, the more silent he was, the more sure they were that they had him. Because that's kind of how we are as people, isn't it? When we think we got somebody and they seem like they've frozen or they're trying to distract us, we think, they're trying to get some room to think. But they're and the longer they go, the more we think they got nothing because they're on number 5. No, I can't do that one either. Let's go through another one, right? And here's the what if I want us just to think about for a moment, and we'll get back to the story. What if Jesus was just giving them time to expose what they were to the crowd? Oh, it gets better. And to themselves. Because isn't it true sometimes time gives us something that no time doesn't give us? That when we have to wait and we keep pushing and sometimes we stop, our minds actually engage because we can just do this all on repeat now. And we begin to think about some of the other stuff. Because what happens next is something I think that we sometimes miss when we read the story. That when they continue to ask Jesus, he raises up. So he's down there, he kind of rises up. He doesn't stand up, he just kind of rises up, looks at him. And he says these words. All right, anyone here who has never sinned, whoever is guiltless, was without sin, can throw the first stone at her. Now, this is one of those moments that is very insightful for all of us to do for ourselves. Because how you hear Jesus says this and how you'll hear Jesus say anything tells you a lot about how you see God, how you think about God, how you feel about God. Because I have to imagine when the woman hears this, she's got her head down and she just goes, oh no. Because maybe she's heard some stories about Jesus, about the miracles, about how he treats people, and she's like hopeful, maybe he'll do something, and all she hears is, all right, whoever doesn't have sin, pick up a stone, go for it. I mean, it has to be just like another crush to where she's at. And whether Jesus says sort of defiantly, anyone without sin, he looks at him harshly, right? Pick up the stone and throw it. I like to think that he sort of says it just casually. I mean, he's been doodling. We don't know what he's been doodling, right? And he's like, all right. Anyone here who's never sinned? You can throw the first stone at her. And then John tells us something incredible. Then he bends back over and he goes to writing on the ground again. I mean, it's like, not really my business here. And he just kind of goes back to it. And it's at this moment that a lot of commentaries, a lot of scholars, they try to figure out again, what is the catalyst for the very next thing that happens? Because what happens next is really dramatic. And is it something that Jesus wrote? And again, what is he writing? And they start to speculate on this. But I think John tells us within itself why they leave. He says, those who, what's the word there? Those who heard Jesus began to leave one by one. Those who heard Jesus say, all right, whoever's guiltless, whoever's never sinned, pick up a stone. They begin to leave one by one. In fact, John tells us, first were the older guys, the elders, and then the younger. You would have thought it would have been the other way, right? That the younger ones couldn't have stood the heat, right? They were like tough until they weren't so tough, right? But it's the old guys, the ones that got a lot in this game, that I picture them putting down their heads and kind of acting like they got a phone call they got to go answer, right? See, when Jesus says those words, anybody who's without sin can pick up the stone. He knows what they knew, that the place they're sitting is holy. It's the temple. It's the place you come meet God at, right? It's also the place that you bring your sacrifice. And you bring a sacrifice to pay for your sins. And everybody in that space who lived in Jerusalem, and everybody who came from out of town to make that sacrifice between whatever period it was, had walked up those huge steps, had walked over to the place where sacrifices were done, and they had done it. You know why they did it? Because they'd sinned. Because you don't need a sacrifice if you have no sin. So whoever's got no sin, step up. And they were smart enough to know, in this spot, I'm not sure I can get away with that. Maybe they might have the feeling that some of you may have today, right? That you're kind of in church for maybe the first time or the first time in a long time. And maybe you're here a little bit like the woman. Last night was kind of a not so great night. And you find yourself here, right? And you're like, kind of surprised people smiled at me when I came in. I kind of expect the walls to fall down. And we're thankful that they didn't, by the way. But we kind of all start to feel that way, feel bad about ourselves and feel like, oh, I shouldn't be here, but I really need to be here. And we're kind of caught with all those emotions. And the reality is, everybody in this space, everybody watching, has been in one of those moments where we feel like we don't belong, but we wish we could. Where we feel like we're not clean enough or holy enough or good enough to enter a space. See, these guys, they didn't just leave. They left the building. They left the temple. And John says something incredible. He says, Jesus was left there alone with the woman standing before him. Again, I go back to the woman, right? Because she's been standing there through this whole thing. You know, clutching what I imagine is a sheet, right? Holding on, hearing the voices. She has no opportunity to fight. She has no opportunity for flight. Already tried those. Now she's just in that frozen mode. Waiting for the stones to happen, waiting for the verdict to happen. Especially when Jesus says, anybody without sin can pick up the first one. I pictured her kind of flinching in that moment, like maybe sneaking a peek, like I thought something was coming, but no, right? But she's sitting there in front of this crowd. And everybody is like, we have no idea what's going on. Because this looked like a cut and dried case. It's like the door was shut. I mean, this was finished before they got here, right? It was just about the final step, about the punishment. And now she's just standing there. John says, so she just standing there in front of Jesus. Jesus still knelt down, because remember, he's been down there. He's looked up at the guys, made that statement. He's back to doodling. And then John says, Jesus then raises up, right? He straightens up again, and he asks her, woman, where are they? And again, we don't know how Jesus says these words, but how we hear those words makes a big difference, right? Whether he says it real proudly. Woman, where are they, right? You know? Or whether he says it with a smile on his face. Hey, where are they, right? Maybe he says it with that question that we sometimes do when we know it's the right time for one of those questions, like, hey, where are they, right? And we're like, yeah, right? Where are they? And then he asks one more question of her. As he's down there looking at her, he says, has no one judged you guilty? Has no one condemned you? Because in their court, in their system, you had to be able to face your witnesses. And the witnesses had to be there. And I want you to notice, he doesn't say, has no one accused you? Because she'd been accused. He doesn't say, but are you guilty? Because she was guilty. This wasn't a question about those things. He's just simply saying, hey, just you, me, and a big group of people over there. But it's kind of like, not those other guys, right? There's nobody here to step up and condemn you. And John simply says, she answers, no one, sir. And again, we don't know how she responds that way. We don't know why she was standing there that whole time, whether, as we all do, our thoughts start to go lots of different places. And maybe in the midst of that, she got her back strong and she was ready to fight, when it was going to be needed. And whether she stands that moment and kind of has the hand on the hip like, no one's here, right? Because she's proud now, or whether this is a kind of the first time she blinks and looks around and begins to see. In fact, I think when she looks out, she sees the crowd, but she doesn't see the crowd. What she's looking for are those guys that grabbed her at a very inopportune moment, who saw her, who drug her here, who were trying to make a statement with her, and they're nowhere to be found because they have left the building. To which Jesus, and if you've been around a place like this, a church before, you've heard this story, and he has that. The last part of the story we hear from John is simply this: that then Jesus says to her, I also don't judge you guilty. I don't condemn you. I wasn't a witness to it, right? I wasn't the one that drug you here. And if you have no witnesses in their law, this is the great part of this, in their law, you have no case. And Jesus is like, I'm not about to step up and judge a case that isn't that way. It doesn't have the pieces that they were wanting. And he says to her, you can go now. Go get yourself fixed up, right? Go take a shower, Maybe take the back gate out of here, kind of. Maybe he looks at some of the disciples, kind of gives them a nudge, like kind of go with her, make sure she's safe, right? But you can go now. You can go now. And he says those words, right? And don't sin anymore. And what I think is interesting is that sometimes people like me can't wait to get to the I lost my voice there for a second. And don't sin anymore part, right? That it's like we can't just tell the story. We got to get to this part to make sure that people don't know that this is not a good thing to do. See, Jesus simply saying, going forward, stay out of those places and spaces and those choices, right? Because here's what, Jesus knew what they knew, and let's be honest, what we know. And that is that every sin comes prepackaged with a cost, with a built-in penalty. And we all know that. You don't have to be religious to know that when you do something that you should not do, and it's like one of those kind of should not do things, there's a cost to it, right? See, we don't need him to punish us, to condemn us, because our sin already has. When that woman's standing there, she doesn't need to be told that she did wrong. Her only question is this going to cost me my life? Is this one night, and what wasn't even one night of passion, it was like sort of passion, right? Because it was caught in the act, right? It's like, is that going to be the mistake that literally changes my life forever? Because here's the reality. Every time we sin, something dies. I'm just going to go through a list. Just see if it resonates. You don't have to raise your hand. Don't nudge anybody while we go through this, all right? But think about this. Every time something dies, right? That walk of shame, right? There's a reason they call it that. Our self-respect, our self-control. Have you noticed that when you've kind of done something that it's easier to do the next time? Even though you've resisted the first time and resisted the second time, but after a while it's like, why resist? It's just not much there. Our self-perception. You ever tell yourself, I'm not that kind of person? Even though you actually did what a person like you would not do? Our self-worth. Because sometimes we've gotten that spot where we think, I'm not worth anything. And the reason we got there is that something has died for so long that now we're it's barely on life support. Our thinking. You ever notice that sometimes when you do something you aren't supposed to do long enough that your thinking begins to change about that thing? We say, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, or isn't as bad as it is, Our conscience. You ever find yourself thinking, I should be bothered about this, but I'm not, and I'm kind of worried I'm not? Last one, because this list has gone long enough. Our relationships. And some of us know dramatically how sin can and has impacted those relationships. How it's torn people apart, messed up families, changed how kids see their parents or how parents see their kids. And what if? What if those consequences are the reason Jesus urged her to sin no more? See, what if he didn't want her to hurt herself anymore? See, it's tempting for followers of Jesus to simply go this way, that when we sin, we break God's law, period, end of story. And there's no doubt that that is the definition of sin. It's lawlessness, it's breaking God's law, all right? But what if that's not the totality of what it means? And why God says, I don't want you to do those things in the first place. Not so I can whack you because you've done bad, but to help you so life will be better. Because what if we also break God's heart and impact others? And impact ours. So Jesus simply says to her, leave it. And sometimes that's not only good advice, that's the right advice. Because we may be in an unsafe relationship, when we feel sort of trapped in, right? Because where else am I going to go? And I got my stuff, and I can't afford. And we convince ourselves of all the things, the reasons we can't, but we also know we can't stay in it. We may be, overwhelmed because we're doing too much. And some of you are doing a whole lot, right? And you got so much stuff, and some of us have never learned the words no. In fact, with those of us who are like that, when we say the words no, we say, no, but okay, I will, right? Because we can't stick there. And we also buy into what our culture's told us, that you can do it all, have it all, and be it all. And I want you to know that's all a bunch of untruth. Untruth is the word we're going with today, all right? Our debt may be out of control. Those lousy student loans, the gift that keeps giving and giving and giving. Hopefully our kids will finish it off, right? But sometimes our debt gets out of control for reasons sort of outside of our control, and sometimes, if we're honest, they were within our control, right? And the reality is our life may be. Our life may be out of control. And when Jesus says, leave it, he's not just commanding her to go and sin no more, to leave it. In fact, what if Jesus was simply providing the chance to do that? What if it was about the opportunity that this moment was creating that she had not had before? Because let's be honest. She's felt the consequence of her sin. Everybody knows about her sin now, right? Because I don't know how many were in that crowd today, but I can guarantee you that within a couple of hours, twice that many people knew the story. Because we're like that. We want people to know and be concerned and pray for her. What if Jesus wasn't just providing that for her, but what if that's one of the things that Jesus does for us? And I know the pushback, because it's the pushback that I've said and I think about, and that's simply this, that it's not that easy. That, Mike, it's not that easy. You don't have an idea. And if you were able to come up here and tell me your story, I would probably agree with you that I have no idea, and it's not that easy. And I would 100% agree, it is not that easy. Because the truth of the matter is, it is easier to get entangled than untangled. And all of us know that, right? You ever notice how easy it is to do some stuff and then they untangle it all? It just seems like it takes forever. And it's like, it only took like 5 minutes, and now this is like, 5 years. And the truth of the matter is, it is easier to stay afraid. But what if Jesus is urging us to a more peaceful way of living? What if it's not a command, but he says, and go and sin no more, but it's his urging to, sweetheart, you can go now, and this is your chance. Find a more peaceful way of living, right? It isn't going to put you in this place, this kind of space like this ever again. What if Jesus is urging us to not live afraid? Afraid of all those things that we're afraid of, that keep us trapped in things that we're afraid of? Because here's the thing I know about Jesus. Probably the most consistent command he would give to his closest followers. In fact, it's a refrain that throughout if you read your Bible, you've seen this statement pop up at different times, and often pops up at times when people have been afraid, and it's simply this. It's the one thing that Jesus wanted most for his followers: to not be afraid. And there was a reason for that. If you read the stories about Jesus, when he says those words, he always either says this next statement or shows it by the fact that he's there, that he's in the boat, that he's on the beach, that wherever the statement comes up, don't be afraid, because I am. I am for you. I am with you. And maybe my favorite of all of those, and you're with me. Something to think about.